Amid the fierce competition of European exploration and colonization in the Americas, St. Augustine emerged as the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States. The story begins in the early 16th century, when Spanish explorers sailed across the Atlantic in search of new riches and territories to expand their vast empire. Florida, that sun-drenched land of lush greenery, was not just a spot on the map. It became a battleground among rival European powers, with Catholic Spain determined to assert its dominance before losing ground to its adversaries. In 1513, the feat of Juan Ponce de León, the Spanish knight and explorer, first touched the shores of Florida during his famed quest for the Fountain of Youth. He claimed the land for the Spanish crown and named it La Florida in honor of the blooming flowers he encountered. Yet, the golden dreams of early settlers quickly shattered against harsh realities. Initial attempts to establish permanent settlements ended in disaster as the Spanish faced fierce resistance from native tribes, rampant disease, and crippling supply shortages. The colony of San Miguel de Gualdape, founded by Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón in 1526, lasted only months before its population perished, while Tristan de Luna's settlement in Pensacola in 1559 collapsed under famine and hurricanes. But the landscape shifted dramatically in the mid-16th century when Protestant France entered the contest. In 1564, French Huguenots, led by René de Goulaine de Laudonnière, established Fort Caroline near the St. Johns River, sparking a diplomatic and military crisis with Spain. King Philip II would not tolerate Protestant rivals in lands he considered reserved for Catholicism. Thus, he entrusted Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, a seasoned naval captain, with the mission to crush the French and establish a lasting Spanish foothold in Florida. In August 1565, Menéndez arrived with his fleet on Florida's coast. On September 8 days after a bloody clash with the French, he formally founded the settlement of San Agustín, named after St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the church's greatest theologians. The location was no accident. Its natural, sheltered harbor made it a strategic stronghold against naval attacks. Soon, St. Augustine became a hub for missionary work and a bulwark guarding Spain's interests in the New World. Over the following centuries, the colony faced immense challenges, from raids by English privateers like Sir Francis Drake, who burned the town in 1586, to conflicts with indigenous tribes. Yet the Spanish demonstrated remarkable resilience, constructing the Castillo de San Marcos in 1672 using coquina stone, which withstood relentless bombardments. Even after Florida was ceded to Britain in 1763 and briefly reclaimed, St. Augustine remained continuously inhabited, standing as a living testament to the dawn of America's colonial history. Today, St. Augustine serves as a rare time capsule, where the past echoes through its cobblestone streets and imposing fortress, reminding us that long before Jamestown, it was the first seed from which modern America grew. In an era when the great European powers were racing to extend their influence across the oceans, when sailing ships carried both the dreams of aspiring empires and their ambitions, St. Augustine was born from the womb of this great historical conflict. The New World represented an enigma to kings and commanders, a mirage of gold and glory shimmering on the distant horizon, yet one that demanded boundless courage and tireless determination to transform into tangible reality. In those days before St. Augustine's founding, Florida served as the stage for a series of failed attempts that revealed the harshness of the New World. The early colonists arrived with grand expectations, imagining golden plains and inexhaustible riches, only to collide with bitter reality. The land that had appeared to them as a lush paradise transformed into a battleground against both nature and man. Strange diseases against which they had no immunity claimed lives mercilessly. Recurring famines due to crop failures made existence unbearable, and tense relations with native tribes escalated into bloody wars that claimed lives on both sides. Yet Spain, at the peak of its imperial power, would not easily relinquish its dream of controlling these lands. The Spanish crown fully understood Florida's strategic value as a natural barrier protecting vital Caribbean trade routes and as a platform for Catholic missions among indigenous tribes. This awareness led King Philip II to make a fateful decision. He commissioned Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, one of the most competent military leaders of the time, with the mission of securing Spanish control over the region definitively. When Menéndez Arrived on Florida's shores during that sweltering summer of 1565, he brought with him clear vision and iron will. He was no ordinary military commander, but rather a practical man with keen insight and a unique ability to adapt to challenging circumstances. His selection of St. Augustine's location was no accident. It resulted from meticulous study of geographic and military considerations. The chosen site combined a naturally protected harbor that could shelter ships, elevated ground providing excellent defensive positioning, and sufficient freshwater sources to meet the settlement's needs. The colony's earliest days tested the settlers' ability to endure. They faced numerous challenges: constructing initial shelters using locally available materials, securing food sources in an unfamiliar environment, and establishing relations with the local Timucua tribes who regarded these strangers with suspicion and wariness. Yet Menéndez demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill in dealing with the natives, employing a combination of military force when necessary and strategic alliances when possible. The Catholic Church played a central role in the Ite colony's life from its inception. The celebration of the First Mass was not merely a religious ritual, but a powerful symbolic declaration of the new colony's cultural and religious identity. The missionary outposts that spread from St. Augustine into the interior served as effective instruments for disseminating Spanish culture and Catholic faith, while also forming vital points of contact between colonists and natives. These missions functioned not just as religious centers, but also as hubs for exchanging knowledge, languages, and cultural traditions. Over subsequent decades, St. Augustine evolved from a small military outpost into a thriving settlement boasting all aspects of civic life. Its cobblestone streets gradually filled with houses built in traditional Spanish style, public squares that hosted religious and social celebrations, and markets bustling with goods arriving from across the Spanish Empire. Cultural life developed significantly, revealing the contours of a multi-layered society that included Spanish colonists alongside immigrants of various European origins, native people assimilated into Spanish culture, and African slaves brought to work on building the colony. Security challenges persisted throughout the colonial period. Repeated attacks from rival powers, particularly England, made fortifying the settlement an absolute priority. The construction of Castillo de San Marcos in the late 17th century marked a pivotal moment in St. Augustine's defensive history. This imposing fortress, with its thick walls of unique coquina stone, became a symbol of Spanish resilience against any assault. Its advanced design, adapted to contemporary siege warfare and artillery developments, rendered it impregnable to all breach attempts. Daily life in 17th and 18th century St. Augustine presented a unique blend of Spanish traditions and local conditions. The governance system mirrored the Spanish administrative model, featuring a crown-appointed governor and a municipal council that shared in managing the colony's affairs. The economy relied on a combination of small-scale agriculture, fishing, trade with other Spanish colonies, and commerce with native populations. Education and culture, though limited in resources compared to major cities in New Spain, began leaving their mark through the establishment of mission schools and efforts to promote literacy. Major geopolitical shifts in Europe profoundly impacted St. Augustine's destiny. The 7 Years' War in the mid-18th century, followed by the American Revolution toward its end, placed the colony at the heart of sweeping regional transformations. The brief period of British rule over Florida, 1763 to 1783, represented an unusual chapter in the city's history, during which the British attempted to impose their character on the colony without being able to erase the deep Spanish imprint accumulated over 2 centuries. When Florida returned to Spanish control in 1783, St. Augustine had begun losing some of its former strategic importance. Yet it retained its unique character as a bridge between cultures and as a living witness to the earliest phases of European colonization in North America. Florida's final transfer to the United States in 1821 did not erase this rich heritage, but rather transformed St. Augustine into a living historical treasure, where the past breathes in every corner. Today, St. Augustine stands as an open-air museum recounting the conflicts and interactions that shaped the New World. Its ancient streets, historic buildings, and famous fortress all hold memories of those pioneers who wrote the first chapter of permanent European settlement in what would become the United States of America. It is not merely a point on the map, but a living connection between past and present, reminding us that history is not just a series of isolated events, but rather a complex tapestry of human choices and objective circumstances that shape our present and inspire our future. The founding of St. Augustine in 1565 marked the beginning of the first permanent European settlement in what would later become the United States, but its survival was far from guaranteed. The settlers, led by the determined Spanish admiral Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, faced a brutal and unforgiving environment, hostile forces, and the immense difficulty of sustaining a fledgling colony in a land that was both foreign and formidable. Their struggles were not merely against the wilderness but against time itself, as hunger, disease, and conflict threatened to erase their fragile foothold in La Florida. From the moment the Spanish ships landed on the shores of what is now northeastern Florida, the colonists were met with a landscape that was both beautiful and treacherous. The land, though fertile, was unfamiliar, and the settlers lacked the knowledge of local agriculture that would have allowed them to thrive. Unlike the native Timucua people, who had mastered the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash, the Spanish relied heavily on supplies from overseas, supplies that were often delayed or lost to storms and shipwrecks. The first winters were particularly harsh, as the settlers, unaccustomed to the seasonal shifts of the region, struggled to store enough food to last through the colder months. Famine became a constant specter, gnawing at the edges of their resolve. Disease, too, was a relentless adversary. The crowded and unsanitary conditions of the early settlement created a breeding ground for illness. European diseases such as smallpox, measles, and dysentery, which had already ravaged indigenous populations, also struck the colonists with deadly force. Without proper medical knowledge or resources, the settlers watched helplessly as their numbers dwindled. The very air seemed to carry death, and the graveyards filled faster than new houses could be built. The Timucua, who might have offered assistance, were themselves suffering from the same epidemics, making any hope of mutual aid fleeting at best. Conflict with indigenous peoples was another ever-present danger. While initial encounters with the Timucua were sometimes peaceful, tensions quickly escalated as the Spanish demand for food and labor strained relations. The settlers, desperate to survive, often took what they needed by force, leading to retaliatory attacks. The Spanish, armed with steel and gunpowder, held a technological advantage, but they were vastly outnumbered and vulnerable to guerrilla tactics. The forests and swamps, which provided the Timucua with perfect cover for ambushes, became places of terror for the colonists. Every foraging party risked annihilation, and every night brought the fear of a sudden raid. Nor were the indigenous peoples the only threat. The French, who had previously established Fort Caroline nearby, saw the Spanish presence as an encroachment on their own colonial ambitions. Though Menéndez had destroyed the French outpost in a surprise attack, survivors and reinforcements remained a danger. French privateers prowled the coastline, ready to strike at Spanish ships or even the settlement itself. The English, too, would later emerge as a formidable enemy, with figures like Sir Francis Drake leading devastating raids that left St. Augustine in ashes. The colony existed in a state of perpetual siege, its survival dependent on the strength of its fortifications and the vigilance of its defenders. Perhaps the greatest challenge of all was isolation. St. Augustine was thousands of miles from the heart of the Spanish Empire, and communication with the crown was slow and unreliable. Requests for additional soldiers, supplies, or priests could take years to be answered, if they were answered at all. The settlers often felt abandoned, forced to rely on their own ingenuity and sheer stubbornness to endure. The ocean, which had brought them to Florida, became a vast and indifferent barrier, separating them from the world they had known. Yet despite these overwhelming hardships, St. Augustine endured. Through famine and plague, through war and neglect, the settlers clung to their foothold in the New World. Their struggles laid the foundation for what would become the oldest continuously inhabited European established city in the continental United States, a testament to human resilience in the face of impossible odds. The early settlers of St. Augustine faced a gauntlet of existential threats that would have broken lesser men. Their story is one of extraordinary perseverance against nature's fury, human conflict, and the psychological torment of extreme isolation in a strange new world. The challenges they confronted were not merely obstacles to survival, but constant tests of their very humanity. From the outset, the environment itself seemed determined to expel these European interlopers. The subtropical climate of Florida proved radically different from what Spanish settlers had known in their homeland. Oppressive humidity hung thick in the air during interminable summers, sapping strength and rotting supplies. The settlers' heavy woolen European clothing became unbearable in the heat, yet offered little protection against the swarms of mosquitoes that rose from nearby marshes in biblical proportions. These insects were not just a nuisance, but vectors for deadly diseases that would soon ravage the colony. The land's fertility was deceptive. While lush vegetation suggested agricultural potential, the sandy coastal soil differed markedly from European farmland. Seeds brought from Spain often failed to thrive in the unfamiliar earth. The settlers lacked knowledge of local growing seasons and which crops might succeed. Their early attempts at farming frequently ended in withered plants and empty stomachs. Without established trade networks, they couldn't supplement their meager harvests, leading to periods of devastating famine where settlers reportedly resorted to eating dogs, rats, and even shoe leather to survive. Water, though abundant, presented its own dangers. The nearby rivers and springs looked inviting, but harbored parasites and bacteria foreign to European constitutions. Dysentery became a constant companion, weakening already malnourished settlers. Saltwater intrusion made some wells undrinkable, while others ran dry during seasonal droughts. The very air they breathed seemed hostile. Humid conditions promoted mold growth in their dwellings, while smoke from cooking fires in poorly ventilated huts caused respiratory ailments. Relations with the Timucua people oscillated between uneasy cooperation and open hostility. Initial encounters followed a familiar colonial pattern, tentative exchanges giving way to mutual suspicion and eventual violence. The Spanish desperately needed the natives' knowledge of local agriculture and geography, but cultural misunderstandings and Spanish demands for food and labor quickly poisoned relations. When trade goods failed to appease native leaders, the Spanish resorted to coercion, sparking cycles of retaliation that left both sides bloodied and distrustful. The settlers' technological advantages proved less decisive than imagined. While Spanish steel weapons and firearms intimidated initially, they required maintenance and supplies the isolated colony struggled to provide. Gunpowder degraded in the humidity, metal rusted, and replacements were months, if not years, away. Meanwhile, the Timucua adapted their guerrilla tactics, learning to avoid open battles where Spanish weapons held sway. Their knowledge of the terrain allowed lightning raids on isolated settlers before disappearing into the trackless wilderness. Disease proved the great equalizer, striking Spaniard and Timucua alike with impartial cruelty. The crowded, unsanitary conditions of the fledgling settlement became breeding grounds for illness. European diseases like smallpox and measles ravaged the native population, while tropical ailments unknown in Europe decimated the colonists. With no understanding of germ theory, the settlers attributed their suffering to divine punishment or malevolent spirits. Their primitive medical practices often exacerbated rather than alleviated suffering, as bleeding and purging weakened patients further. The French threat loomed constantly, even after the destruction of Fort Caroline. Survivors of Menéndez's massacre and subsequent French privateers lurked in the coastal waters, waiting for opportunities to strike back. Spanish supply ships risked interception, leaving the colony vulnerable to blockade. The settlers lived with the gnawing fear that a French fleet might appear on the horizon at any moment, bringing retribution for their commander's ruthless actions against the Huguenots. Perhaps most insidious was the psychological toll of their isolation. Cut off from Spain by months of perilous ocean travel, the settlers existed in a kind of suspended animation between worlds. News from home arrived stale and fragmentary if it arrived at all. They missed births, deaths, and the entire rhythm of life in their homeland. The weight of their solitude pressed down daily as they struggled to maintain European customs in an environment that constantly undermined them. Some turned to religion for solace, while others succumbed to despair or madness. Yet through these unimaginable hardships, the settlers persisted. They learned to build homes from local materials, to identify edible native plants, to navigate the complex politics of native relations. Slowly, painfully, they adapted to their new world even as they tried to remake it in their image. Their Stubborn refusal to abandon St. Augustine, despite every reason to do so, laid the foundation for European permanence in North America. The colony's survival against such overwhelming odds stands as one of history's great testaments to human resilience in the face of adversity. The crucible of St. Augustine's founding forged a new kind of colonial society through unimaginable hardship. The settlers' ordeal began before they even made landfall, as treacherous Atlantic crossings claimed ships and lives. Those who survived the voyage arrived weakened and vulnerable, only to face an alien ecosystem that defied all their European expectations. The very geography conspired against them. Where they anticipated gentle Mediterranean-like shores, they encountered shifting sandbars that wrecked their vessels, dense mangrove swamps that bred disease, and dense forests that concealed both danger and opportunity. The biological shock of encountering Florida's ecology proved devastating. European digestive systems recoiled at unfamiliar foods, while native crops provided incomplete nutrition. Spanish livestock brought across the ocean sickened and died when exposed to strange parasites. The settlers watched helplessly as their precious pigs and cattle, vital sources of food and labor, succumbed to ailments no Spanish veterinarian could identify. Meanwhile, the absence of European staples like wheat and olives created constant cravings that no amount of maize or squash could satisfy, creating a psychological hunger that mirrored their physical deprivation. Water management became an unexpected crisis. The settlers' traditional European well-digging techniques failed in Florida's porous limestone bedrock, where freshwater mixed unpredictably with saltwater intrusions. Their attempts to recreate Spanish irrigation systems in the flat coastal plain led to flooding and mosquito infestations. Even successful water sources became death traps when native alligators, creatures straight from medieval bestiaries, dragged unsuspecting settlers to watery graves. The Spanish found themselves constantly thirsty in a land seemingly overflowing with undrinkable water. The material culture they brought proved woefully inadequate. Spanish armor rusted in the salt. Wool clothing rotted in the humidity, and wooden tools warped beyond use. Without access to familiar building materials, they struggled to recreate European-style structures, eventually adopting native thatching techniques for roofs and learning to use local shells for making lime mortar. Their prized metal implements became so valuable that blacksmiths occupied positions of critical importance in the struggling colony. Social structures buckled under the strain of constant adversity. The strict Spanish class system blurred as nobles found themselves laboring alongside commoners in the daily struggle for survival. Traditional gender roles shifted when women took on unexpected responsibilities in the absence of men lost to disease or conflict. The Catholic Church, normally a pillar of Spanish colonial society, found its authority challenged by desperate settlers more concerned with earthly survival than spiritual matters. Perhaps most remarkably, the constant state of emergency fostered unexpected cultural exchanges. Spanish settlers adopted Timucua fishing techniques and hunting strategies. Some learned to navigate by native methods, reading subtle signs in the landscape that European maps failed to capture. A handful even took native wives, creating the first mestizo families in what would become the United States. These practical adaptations occurred despite official Spanish policies discouraging such mixing, proving necessity's power to overcome prejudice. The colony's military situation remained perpetually precarious. Even after constructing the first fortifications, the settlers faced constant anxiety about their defenses. Their cannons, impressive on paper, often lacked sufficient powder due to supply shortages. The coquina stone used in later fortifications, while ultimately effective, took years to quarry and shape. In the interim, the colonists relied on wooden palisades that termites and rot constantly compromised. Night watches became exercises in terror as every rustling bush might signal an approaching enemy. Disease cycles created waves of demographic catastrophe just as the colony seemed stabilized. The arrival of each new ship from Europe brought not just supplies but fresh outbreaks of illness. Children proved particularly vulnerable, with infant mortality rates that would shock modern sensibilities. The constant deaths created a society perpetually in mourning, where few adults reached middle age and elders became rare treasures. This demographic instability made it nearly impossible to maintain consistent leadership or pass down institutional knowledge. The psychological landscape mirrored the physical challenges. Settlers reported vivid dreams of their Spanish homeland that made awakening to their harsh reality even more painful. Some developed Florida fever, a catch-all term for the malaise and depression that afflicted many colonists. The constant stress manifested in increased religious visions, interpersonal violence, and occasional desertions into the wilderness, though few who chose this path survived long. Yet through this unimaginable hardship, the settlers developed something extraordinary: a distinct Floridian identity. Neither fully Spanish nor native, this emerging culture blended practical adaptations with stubborn traditions. They celebrated Catholic feast days with local foods, sang Spanish ballads adapted to native rhythms, and created hybrid architectural styles. This cultural synthesis, born from sheer necessity, became St. Augustine's most enduring legacy, proof that human creativity can flourish even in the most adverse conditions. The true miracle of St. Augustine lies not in its mere survival, but in how its settlers transformed their trauma into the foundation for a new society. Their story reminds us that the most significant historical transitions often occur not through grand battles or treaties, but through the daily acts of ordinary people struggling to feed their families, protect their communities, and make meaning in an unfamiliar world. The challenges they faced and overcame continue to echo in the multicultural fabric of Florida today, making St. Augustine's early history not just a tale of the past, but a living legacy still shaping the present. The city of St. Augustine, founded in 1565 by Spanish explorer Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, was one of the earliest permanent European settlements in what is now the United States. Due to its strategic location on the coast of Florida, the city was vulnerable to attacks from rival powers, including the British, pirates, and hostile native tribes. As threats increased, Spanish authorities recognized the need for a permanent fortress capable of withstanding prolonged sieges and repelling repeated assaults. Thus, construction began on Castillo de San Marcos in 1672, becoming the cornerstone of St. Augustine's defense system. The fortress was built using local coquina stone, a type of sedimentary rock composed of compressed shells, known for its remarkable resistance to cannon fire. Unlike wooden forts, which were susceptible to burning and destruction, Castillo de San Marcos stood firm against bombardment. Its thick walls absorbed the impact of cannonballs rather than shattering. Its star-shaped design, with defensive bastions at each corner, allowed defenders to unleash crossfire on any approaching enemy forces. The fort played a crucial role in defending St. Augustine during multiple conflicts, including Queen Anne's War in the early 18th century, when British forces besieged the city for 2 months in 1702. Despite British numerical superiority, the fort's resilient walls and well-coordinated defense forced them to retreat. It also withstood another British attack in 1740, proving its near invincibility as a fortress at the time. Beyond its military function, Castillo de San Marcos served as a symbol of Spanish power in the New World. It sent a clear message to rival European nations that St. Augustine was strongly defended and not easily captured. Additionally, the fort provided a safe refuge for local residents during times of danger, offering shelter when the city came under attack. Over the years, control of the fort shifted between Spain, Britain, and eventually the United States, but its defensive significance endured. Even after becoming technologically outdated, Castillo de San Marcos remained a testament to Spanish military engineering prowess and its ability to protect Spain's interests in Florida for centuries. Amid the colonial conflicts that marked Florida during the 17th and 18th centuries, Fuerte Mose, emerged as one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of St. Augustine, and indeed in all of American history. Established in 1738 by Spanish governor Manuel de Montiano, this settlement was the first legally sanctioned free community of formerly enslaved Africans in what is now the United States. It played a vital role in the struggle between the Spanish and British empires while also standing as a symbol of freedom and resistance in a world where slavery was deeply entrenched. Under Spanish rule, Florida followed a different policy regarding escaped slaves compared to the British colonies. While the British colonies of Georgia and the Carolinas enforced harsh slave laws, Spanish authorities declared that any enslaved person who fled British territory and reached Florida would be granted freedom, provided they converted to Catholicism and pledged loyalty to the Spanish crown. This decision was both strategic and religious, as the Spanish saw these fugitives as potential allies in their conflict against the British. Thus, escaped slaves from the Carolinas and Georgia began arriving in St. Augustine, where they formed a free community under Spanish protection. In 1738, Fort Mose was officially established 2 miles north of St. Augustine, serving as the first line of defense against potential British attacks. Its residents, free black men and women, were militia soldiers for the Spanish, tasked with defending the city from invasions. These individuals displayed immense courage, knowing that if captured, they would be returned to enslavement under British rule. Fort Mose proved its military significance during the War of Jenkins' Ear, 1739 to 1748, when the British attempted to invade St. Augustine. In 1740, James Oglethorpe, the British governor of Georgia, launched a major assault on the city, but the defenders of Fort Mose helped repel the attack, forcing British troops to retreat. This battle demonstrated the loyalty of the free African community to the Spanish crown and solidified Fort Mose's role as a strategic stronghold. However, life at Fort Mose was not without challenges. After the war ended, Spanish support for Yixi, the settlement waned, and it was eventually abandoned for a time. As political alliances shifted, many of its inhabitants were forced to relocate to Cuba when Spain ceded Florida to Britain in 1763. Nevertheless, the legacy of Fort Mose endured as a testament to the struggle for freedom in an era when slavery was a global institution. Today, the site of Fort Mose is remembered as one of the most significant historical landmarks telling the story of resistance against slavery and the quest for liberty. It is a story of courage and determination, proving that even in the darkest periods of history, there were those who stood against oppression. Over the centuries of its early history, the city of St. Augustine stood as a focal point of colonial conflicts in the New World, enduring repeated attacks from pirates and British forces seeking to undermine Spanish influence in Florida. These assaults posed an existential threat to the fledgling Spanish settlement, compelling colonial authorities to continuously strengthen the city's defenses, a process that profoundly influenced its urban, military, and social development. From its founding in 1565, St. Augustine found itself in the crosshairs of pirates who mercilessly plundered ships and coastal settlements. In 1586, the infamous English privateer Sir Francis Drake attacked and burned the city, exposing the vulnerability of its early defenses. This raid served as a harsh wake-up call to the Spanish, who realized that permanent fortifications were essential if they hoped to maintain their foothold in Florida. Yet pirates were not the only danger. As British colonies expanded across North America, St. Augustine became a strategic target for British ambitions. In 1668, the city suffered a devastating attack by the pirate Robert Searle, who slaughtered dozens of residents and looted vast quantities of supplies. This incident, in particular, became the catalyst for the Spanish to begin constructing the Castillo de San Marcos in 1672, the massive stone fortress that would later symbolize Spanish resilience against foreign threats. Tensions reached their peak in the 18th century during Queen Anne's War when British forces under Governor James Moore besieged the city in 1702. Although the British succeeded in burning St. Augustine to the ground, they failed to capture the Castillo de San Marcos, saving the Spanish presence in Florida from collapse. These events reinforced the fortress's role as the military command center and accelerated the development of a network of secondary fortifications around the city. These conflicts were not merely military confrontations, but had deep demographic and economic repercussions. After each major attack, the Spanish brought in additional soldiers and settlers from Cuba and other regions to replenish the population and compensate for losses. The constant need to fortify the city also fostered a local economy centered around military construction, with professions like masonry, carpentry, and weaponsmithing thriving as a result. Ultimately, it can be argued that the persistent threats from pirates and the British shaped St. Augustine's defensive identity, transforming it from a fragile outpost into an impregnable stronghold. These challenges imposed a security-first pattern of development on the city, evident in its architecture, which retains a distinctly militaristic character to this day. St. Augustine, the oldest permanent European settlement in the continental United States, was the stage for a series of geopolitical shifts that forever altered the region's destiny. From its founding by the Spanish in 1565 to its final transition to American control, The city experienced multiple changes in allegiance and sovereignty, each resulting from major imperial conflicts that redrew the power map of the New World. In the early days of Spanish colonization, St. Augustine was little more than a small fort facing constant threats from native populations, pirates, and rival European powers. Yet its strategic location along the Florida Straits made it a coveted prize among empires. The first major transfer of sovereignty came in 1763 with the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, when Spain was forced to cede Florida to Britain in exchange for the return of Havana. The Spanish evacuated the city, carrying away whatever they could transport, leaving behind a community that had taken 2 centuries to establish. Under British rule, St. Augustine underwent significant demographic changes as British settlers arrived from northern colonies, while many Spanish loyalists migrated to Cuba. However, this British interlude was short-lived. With the outbreak of the American Revolution, Britain found itself on the defensive. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War, returned Florida to Spain as a reward for Spanish support of the rebellious colonies against Britain. The return to Spanish rule was not a simple restoration of the old order. The Spanish, once a dominant power in the New World, now governed a territory increasingly shaped by Anglo-Saxon influences. Florida's northern border became a point of contention with the rapidly expanding United States. Tensions escalated as enslaved people fled from Georgia to Spanish Florida, where they could secure their freedom, a policy that infuriated American plantation owners. Ultimately, the inevitable end of Spanish rule came in 1821 when Spain signed the Adams-Onis Treaty, ceding Florida to the United States in exchange for American relinquishment of claims to Texas. With this transfer, St. Augustine entered a new era as part of a young nation forging its national identity. St. Augustine witnessed major historical transformations that shaped the destiny of North America, changing hands between 3 great empires in less than 6 decades. The roots of these successive transitions lie in the imperial conflict that intensified in the 18th century, when Florida became a bargaining chip in major European conflicts. In 1763, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris that ended the French and Indian War, Spain found itself compelled to cede Florida to Great Britain. This decision was part of a larger settlement involving multiple territorial concessions between European powers. The Spanish left the city in a sorrowful procession, carrying with them the remains of their dead and precious belongings, leaving behind imposing structures like the Castillo de San Marcos, which suddenly became a British fortress. During the 20-year British period, the city underwent a radical demographic and cultural transformation. Thousands of British settlers arrived from northern colonies, bringing with them new traditions and lifestyles. Florida was divided into eastern and western parts, with St. Augustine becoming the capital of the eastern portion. The British attempted to revitalize the economy through land grants and agricultural encouragement, but tensions with the Seminole natives remained a persistent challenge. With the outbreak of the American Revolution, Florida became a haven for British loyalists fleeing the rebellious colonies. St. Augustine played a strategic role as a safe port for the British Navy and a base for raids on southern colonies. But the American victory in the war reversed the situation, and in the Second Treaty of Paris in 1783, the British were forced to return Florida to Spain in exchange for the Bahamas. The return to Spanish rule placed the city before a new reality. The Spanish Empire, once a great power, was beginning to show signs of weakness. The Spanish tried to revive old policies, including granting freedom to slaves escaping from the United States, which angered their northern neighbors. They also faced internal challenges with the growing influence of English-speaking settlers, who now formed the majority of the population. In the second decade of the 19th century, with increasing American pressure and the erosion of Spanish power in the New World, Florida's transfer to the United States became only a matter of time. The official end came in 1821 when the American flag was raised over the Castillo de San Marcos, ending 3 centuries of intermittent Spanish rule and opening a new chapter in the city's history. The early life of the first settlers in St. Augustine was fraught with challenges and hardships as they faced a harsh environment for which they were not entirely prepared. Spanish colonists, led by Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, arrived on the coast of Florida in 1565, carrying dreams of establishing a permanent settlement that would serve as a stronghold for the Spanish Empire in the New World. However, Their dreams soon collided with a harsh reality of scarce resources, constant threats from native populations, diseases, and famine. In the earliest days, the settlers relied heavily on supplies brought by ships from Spain, but delays in shipments, due to storms or pirate attacks, meant shortages of food and essential tools. As a result, the settlers had to adapt to the new land, learning from the native peoples, such as the Timucua tribes, how to cultivate crops like corn, squash, and beans, crops that were better suited to Florida's climate than European staples. They also turned to fishing and gathering shellfish from the abundant waters around them, providing a steady source of protein. Food was not the only challenge. The settlers struggled with construction due to a lack of suitable materials. Initially, they used wood and branches to build temporary shelters, but these structures were not sturdy enough to withstand frequent hurricanes. Over time, they developed more durable building techniques using local coquina stone, leading to the construction of buildings capable of enduring both weather and attacks. Disease also posed a major threat, as their immune systems were unprepared for New World illnesses, while harsh living conditions led to outbreaks. To combat this, the settlers tried to implement some of the health practices they knew from Europe, such as isolating the sick. But they also relied on medicinal herbs learned from the natives. Relations with local tribes were volatile. Sometimes, the native people aided the settlers with food and knowledge, while at other times, bloody conflicts erupted over land and resources. The Spanish leveraged these shifting alliances to ensure their survival, sometimes using diplomacy and trade, and other times resorting to force. Over the decades, St. Augustine evolved from a fragile outpost into a resilient small town, thanks to the settlers' ability to adapt to the environment and learn from their mistakes. Their survival was the product of perseverance, forced cooperation with native peoples, and innovation in the face of a relentless natural world. The colony of St. Augustine, founded in 1565 by the Spanish, was one of the earliest permanent European settlements in what is now the United States. The early settlers faced significant challenges in securing food, especially in an unfamiliar environment full of dangers and unknown resources. Initially, they relied on food supplies they brought from Europe, such as wheat, olives, wine, and salted meats. But these provisions were insufficient to ensure their long-term survival. They soon realized the necessity of exploring local resources and learning hunting and farming techniques from the Native Americans, who had lived in the region for centuries. Hunting was one of the most important food sources for the settlers, as the area was abundant with wild animals such as deer, bears, rabbits, and birds. Nearby rivers and the Atlantic Ocean also provided a rich source of fish and shellfish, helping to diversify their diet. Additionally, the settlers learned from the Timucua and other local tribes how to cultivate staple crops like corn, squash, and beans, which later became fundamental to the colony's economy. Over time, the settlers introduced European farming techniques and attempted to grow crops such as wheat and grapes, but Florida's subtropical climate was not ideal for these plants. However, they later succeeded in cultivating citrus fruits and sugarcane, contributing to the colony's prosperity. Livestock farming, including cattle and pigs, also became an essential part of their lives, providing meat, milk, and hides. Life was not easy, as the settlers endured periods of famine due to hurricanes, conflicts with local tribes, or rival European powers. Yet, over the years, they managed to develop a sustainable food system that combined local and imported resources, enabling them to endure and build a lasting community in the New World. When the Spanish established the settlement of St. Augustine in 1565, their first step was to construct a simple wooden fort to protect the colonists from potential attacks. However, they quickly realized the need for more durable structures to withstand the climatic and military challenges of this new land. The early architecture of St. Augustine was characterized by a blend of Spanish traditions and adaptations to local conditions, producing a unique style that remains visible in the city's ancient ruins to this day. The building materials used reflected the resources available in the region. Initially, settlers utilized local timber and tree branches covered with clay to create simple dwellings resembling Timucua huts. But as the colony stabilized, they began importing stone and bricks from other Spanish settlements in the Caribbean, allowing for more permanent structures. One of the most distinctive features of early Spanish architecture in St. Augustine was the use of tabby construction, a technique common in Spain involving a mixture of clay, sand, and straw. The thick walls made with this method provided excellent insulation against Florida's intense heat and were relatively resistant to hurricanes. Roofs were typically made of imported red tiles or local palm thatch, with a slight slope to drain the heavy rainfall. Defensive functionality was never absent from the architectural design. In addition to the main fort, which later evolved into the stone Castillo de San Marcos, many residential buildings featured small windows and narrow firing slits. Houses were also built around enclosed central courtyards, a traditional Spanish design that provided privacy and security for families. Public buildings such as the church and government warehouses were more massive, with stone arches and watchtowers. The Spanish also introduced advanced construction techniques like barrel vaults, which helped withstand the high humidity. Over time, these architectural elements came to represent St. Augustine's distinctive identity, where practical necessity merged with the cultural symbols of the Spanish Empire.